Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Albinism Awareness Series, a joint effort between the ILDS, the GLODERM Trainee Committee, and the Global Albinism Alliance. My name is Akash Varma. I'm the current chair of the GLODERM Trainee Committee, and our co-host today is Antoine Glickson, the executive director of the Global Albinism Alliance.
Welcome, everyone. So we will have 4 different sessions in this webinar series. We will first cover genetics, then dermatology, then we will have a webinar on ophthalmology, and finally, last webinar addressing the social impacts of albinism.
And all of these webinars will have additional live Q&A time. So as I mentioned, your hosts today are me, Akash Varma, and Antoine Glickson. So I just want to give you a little information about the organizations which we represent. GLODERM is the International Alliance for Global Health Dermatology, and it's an official program of the International Foundation for Dermatology under the International League of Dermatologic Societies. The mission for GLODERM is to improve skin health for everyone everywhere by connecting dermatologists and trainees who are dedicated to improving skin health for all in resource-limited communities locally and globally. I represent the GLODERM Trainee Committee, and our main mission is to make sure that we disseminate information to individuals all over the world and increase education for dermatologist training in all settings.
And as mentioned before, my name is Antoine Glickson. I'm the executive director of the Global Albinism Alliance. The Global Albinism Alliance is a young international NGO that was launched about 4 years ago in 2020. Today, we represent about 250 associations and other NGOs that are serving the albinism community in all regions of the world. The mission of the GA is structured around 3 main pillars. We exist first to support albinism organizations that operate around the world. We act also to improve knowledge about albinism. And finally, we are the voice of the albinism community at the global level. And in that frame, we advocate to improve and protect the rights of persons with albinism at that level.
Great. So just to run over some etiquette for today's webinar, if you have any questions or comments, please submit them via the chat function. Our speakers will answer your questions at the end of the webinar. And we will be sharing further information about the GLODERM Trainee Committee and the Global Albinism Alliance in the webinar chat, so please be on the lookout for that.
Before we start, I'd like to remind you that this webinar series is put together and offered to you as a way to celebrate International Albinism Awareness Day, which has been celebrated since 2015 every year on June 13th.
Welcome to our 4th and final session of the Albinism Awareness Series, where we will talk about the social impacts of albinism, which of course is a very important topic and something that we may not always get education on in the academic field. Today, we have an amazing speaker with us here today who I'll introduce in our next slide. I'm honored to introduce Ikponwosa, a renowned human rights advocate who served as the first UN independent expert on the enjoyment of human rights by persons with albinism. With over a decade of experience, she has contributed to numerous AU and UN resolutions and played a key role in initiatives like the African Union Plan of Action on Albinism in Africa. Currently, she is director of the Human Rights Advocacy at Under the Same Sun and the executive director of the Africa Albinism Network. And with no further ado, here you have Ikponwosa.
Okay, thank you, everyone. My name is Ikponwosa, and I'm originally from Nigeria. I am a woman with albinism, and I served as the UN expert on albinism from 2015 to 2021. And currently, I'm the executive director of the Africa Albinism Network. Today, I'm going to be talking about the social impacts of having albinism. My presentation will focus on these 6 key aspects, and those are the social impacts from a very high level, and I will speak about the human rights framing of social impacts. I will speak about the barriers to social impacts being rectified, because there are efforts to rectify some of the negative social impacts, and we face barriers in doing them. There are implications to the human rights framing of social impacts, and then we'll see some best practices, what has worked in several places, and then we can do some question and answers. So what are some of the social impacts of albinism? Social impacts are basically those resulting factors or elements or experiences that one faces in interaction with others because of a particular feature that they have. In this case, is albinism. So what are some of the resulting consequences when people with albinism interact with other people in their community, in their society? And these are 4 key areas that I wanted to highlight. There's obviously going to be more for those who have done wide-ranging research, but I feel like most of them can be classified in one of these 4. And the first is this myths and misconceptions. Basically, albinism is a very unique condition. You tend to stand out. My entire family, for instance, is Black, and in the typical West African manifestation of what Black is. And so it's not easy to miss that this one child out of 6 looks different. In the photo on the screen right now, there is also a young man holding on to a child with albinism from the Congo. And the condition is very jarring when the community has a lot of pigmentation. So this has resulted in myths about what albinism is, where it comes from. There's a lot of supernatural stories that are told about albinism that could be very dangerous, such as the myth that people with albinism are from other worlds, or that they're types of gods. Even the myths that are supposedly good are dangerous because they put the person at a place where they're not human, and they put the value of the person in the hands of anybody. So people with albinism are obviously human beings, but these myths and misconceptions are rampant, not only in parts of Africa, but worldwide, especially where they stand out. There are other myths, such as the myth that the body parts of people with albinism can be used in potions or in witchcraft to bring about good results. And for this reason, many people with albinism have been attacked in many parts of Africa where most of these types of attacks happen. There are other forms of misconceptions, like albinism is a type of contagious disease. And so you find people with albinism confined or hidden in parts of South Asia. Stigma is also widespread worldwide, and the appearance is stigmatized because it's not keeping with what is expected. So you have people with albinism facing barriers to employment, especially in the hospitality industry. They are often not hired out of fear that they would scare off customers or that they would contaminate the food. So there's also reports from Japan, for instance, of people with albinism being forced to dye their hair Black as part of the school uniform and to mute their albinism, take efforts to mute the appearance of albinism. There are also multiple and intersecting discrimination. So even if you're working in the area of health, it's very good to be aware that the discrimination faced by people with albinism happens at several levels within their family, based on their gender, if they're women. So women with albinism are more prone to discrimination than the men because of sexual based myths that women with albinism can cure HIV/AIDS if you have sexual intercourse with them. There's also discrimination in education, discrimination at the workplace due to lack of accommodation, because people with albinism have low vision or vision impairment, most of them, and often need things like large screens or software. So all these discriminations play out together, and they're described as multiple and intersecting in a way that it creates a unique experience in that person. So if we focus only on one of those areas, that's fine, but it's good to keep in mind that other areas are playing along with the one area that we're working at, and how can we address that? How can we address the fact that a woman with albinism may be facing layers of discrimination in addition to the health discrimination that you are trying to help with? So this awareness is key, and it makes it necessary to find partners to find transdisciplinary approaches to research and implementation of support structures. And finally, exclusion and isolation is rampant. Mental health issues among people with albinism is rampant because of feelings of being isolated, not being accepted by one or the other group. I read a book once by an African American with albinism, was called Too White to Be White and Too Black or something like that. Too Black to be white. Yes, Too Black to be white and Too White to be Black. I think it was Edward Lee Edwards is the authors of that book, the author of the book. And it really captures the paradox that people with albinism have to live in. We all have to live in paradoxes every day. Like, I don't want to work on Monday, but I have to. There's a paradoxes, but in people with albinism, these paradoxes can have stigmatizing, discriminatory effects that go beyond not wanting to work on Monday. The human rights framework really helps the social impact of albinism for several reasons. First, the human rights framework aims to protect people from negative social impacts, okay? And it also finds remedies. It finds ways to remedy where there has been an injustice in the social interaction based on grounds that really nobody should be discriminated against. There's very few grounds that allow discrimination. For instance, somebody who is guilty of a serious crime loses his freedom or her freedom and is put in prison. In that moment, that person doesn't need the protection of their freedom because they've done something unjust that needs rectifying. Aside from those few exceptions, generally, people are protected and from any form of discrimination for whatever reason. And there are standards that have been set out by the United Nations. They are universal standards, which means cultural reasons are not an excuse not to carry out those standards, to protect people and to remedy where injustice or lack of protection has happened. These universal standards are based on the intrinsic worth and dignity of the human person, recognition that every human being is fundamentally born free and should live as free as possible, and that those freedoms shouldn't be limited unless it's absolutely necessary, like in the example I gave about the prisoner who, assuming he was justly convicted. The primary responsibility of protecting people in the human rights framework is the state. So as the government has a primary responsibility. That said, other partners can join the state in various forms to carry out those responsibilities of protecting people from discrimination in all sectors, health, education, and family life, and also to ensure that they are remedied when a discrimination or a harm has occurred. And harm is broadly construed, broadly interpreted. Discrimination, broadly interpreted. It's not only refusal to give a service, it's also their experience in the service, or if the service is too late. Anything that seems unjust is likely a case of discrimination, but we have to test them through the standards that have been established. And usually those standards are interpreted quite liberally, quite broadly, because the goal is to protect people from harm. Most of the universal standards are binding legally. So whenever there's a treaty, it's binding on the countries. The only problem is that there is no police, like international police on these universal standards. There are police for peacekeeping operations, for instance, but police in terms of a country's failure to carry out their human rights obligation doesn't exist. So the best thing the UN does is kind of naming and shaming, making press releases and comments or calling out countries, which can be very effective because countries don't like to be called out. Finally, a very good part of the human rights framing of social impact of albinism is that it centers on the agency of the person with albinism. It allows you to have rights. You are the subject of your own life. This is one area where I believe we need to work very closely with the health field to help them understand that their field fundamentally is necessary, but also fundamentally looks at the person as an object, which makes sense because from the scientific point of view, you're studying something. That thing is an object. So that's valid. But from what I said earlier about multiple and intersecting discrimination is critical, that people in the scientific field have to be aware that in the human rights framing, the person has agency and is paramount and becomes a subject of their own condition. So in practical terms, this means treating the person not only as a patient, but also as a human person, as a subject of their own lives, about their own rights, and engaging them in processes, in research, treating them as experts of their own condition, even while applying the rigor of science. One key advocate in this area is called Rick Guidotti. He has a website called positiveexposure.org, and he goes around medical schools and the medical community trying to pass on this message about being transdisciplinary when you deal with genetic conditions, not only very narrow on the science, but also intersecting that rigor with the broader notion of the human dignity of the person. There are some key treaties that exist. The first is not quite a treaty, but is known by many people. It's called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is the philosophical basis of all human rights standards today at the UN and internationally. It is not binding. However, it sets goals and guidelines and the aspiration of the world, especially because it came up after the Second World War, where people really didn't want that to happen anymore. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a really good starting point. However, the binding treaties below that are the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that cover the right to life in detail, freedom from torture, because attacks against people with albinism is a type of torture, slavery, the right to privacy, and so on. There's also a second covenant called the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, covering the right to health, right to work, housing. So what they did was they took the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and then split it into two types of rights, civil and political, and economic, social, and cultural. And the reason they did that was they felt that the civil and political rights can be granted today, the right to live can be granted today. The right to vote, the right to privacy, you can grant those now by stopping the discrimination or stopping certain actions that against the dignity of the person. The economic, social, and cultural rights, they felt took longer, right? The right to housing, the right to health. They felt like before you provide healthcare to everyone with albinism, it might be like 20 years in one country. So they split them into the rights that are more immediate versus the rights that require progressive realization. But there's constant debates among people whether this is an artificial separation, because at the end of the day, you can't really separate these two types of rights from each other. In the reality of human beings, we are needing both. You need the right to health right away so you can have the right to life. But that's a philosophical debate that I will park on the side. What you should be aware of is that there are these two covenants, but also in addition, a whole host of other treaties, together 10 of them, that are covering all these human rights to protect people from negative social impacts, and all of them are binding. The states, the countries have obligations under them. If I were to summarize, their obligation is to respect those rights and freedoms, is to protect those rights and freedom, and to fulfill them, even when it is not the state who is doing the action. So people with albinism have been attacked by civilians sometimes, not government. But if the government doesn't prevent that attack, protect people with albinism to fulfill these human rights, then they become complicit, right, in that act, and they have failed in their responsibility. There are ways to remedy things by going to various tribunals at the UN, various committees governing these treaties, to bring out the facts, to publish them, to call the countries out. These take time, but they can be quite effective. So the human rights issues is a way of summarizing the social impacts that are negative. I'm focusing more on the negative because the positive social impacts doesn't need me to state them. It's just people living in peace, basically. But these are the areas that need attention. So the right to life, obviously, because of the attacks and also because of the health issues. particularly skin cancer, which is the #1 killer of people with albinism worldwide. In Africa, yes, but also worldwide, because I saw people die early, even in the Pacific and in South Asia, because of lack of access to some protection creams, sun blockers, and so on and so forth. The second right is the security of the person, especially not only with attacks, but with gender-based violence, torture, because many people are attacked in torturous ways, usually with machetes, and left to die slowly. There is also tomb desecration, like people's who have died, their body parts are dug up and sold or used in so-called witchcraft and ritual practices. There is also discrimination in various areas and based on various things. In the health sector, we talked about that, lack of access to sunscreen, lack of access to care after skin cancer has been contracted. Impairments, because albinism comes with vision impairment. There is discrimination when there is no reasonable accommodation in classrooms, so people can't really study or work well. There is an attitude as well, even when you have vision support, you have health support, the attitude, if it's still there, causes a disability. Because one thing the UN has done is it has made disability a consequence of lack of accommodation. Disability is no longer on the person's body. What is on the body could be an impairment. But if we accommodate that impairment, the person is fine. There is no disability. But the moment you don't accommodate the impairment, then a disability ensues. So the disability is not on the person, but rather a situation we create when we don't accommodate. There's also the right to education and all the accessibility issues which I just referred to, same as employment. Color discrimination or racial discrimination is an interesting one because people with albinism are often not a different race, but get discriminated against based on their color by people of their similar race or ethnicity. So this makes them oftentimes victims of color-based discrimination or racial discrimination, which should not be confused with racism, because racial discrimination is like an adjective that shows you that the experience is similar to racism, but it's not the same, or has almost the same effect. There is also discrimination based on gender, which I've talked about. Harmful practices such as the attacks and the rapes. Refugee problems with people trying to get out of unsafe environments into other countries, or within their country, they become an IDP or an internally displaced person. Issues about being a minority. When you're few, you're isolated. This kind of worsens your experience of isolation. And then access to justice when there's a failure of domestic remediation. Here's a brief slide showing you a trend in the attacks so that you understand what has been going on. We mapped out the attacks by type, so the colors are by type. Sorry, the graph is quite small, but nonetheless, the types were like killings and trafficking, people who were their body parts were taken. So we mapped this out. But what I wanted you to take from this is that in the last 16 years, the attacks have been on a downward trend, as you can see, but there have been spikes, and this can be explained. There was a spike when the UN got involved. Subsequently, there was a second spike when the mandate of the UN expert got created, and the mandate holder, which was myself, traveled around to get data. People reported more, the numbers spiked. And then things started going down again because of all the awareness. And then a little bit of a spike around COVID, because people started going after people with albinism, thinking there were people that could maybe cure COVID, or for whatever reason, there was a spike during that time, because superstitions tend to go up when there's a crisis. All right. There are many barriers to the human rights framework. It's not a panacea. It's not perfect, but it does capture very well and tries as much as possible to take care of social impacts that are negative. The barriers I summarized here, and there could be more, is that no awareness of human rights by people who should know, right? Like the people who are most vulnerable. And there's no awareness sometimes from even the states who should be protecting those rights. The agents of the states may not be well versed about those rights and their obligations. There's low investments, even when they know there's very low investment. Disabilities in general, of which albinism is a constituency, has very low investment compared to other issues such as women's rights, which is a shame because there are about 1 billion people with disabilities worldwide. So with that as a starting point, albinism is even smaller. It has a very tiny part of that pie. We haven't been able to consolidate how much is invested in this issue, but it's very minute. I can tell you that. So most albinism groups in Africa have a budget that is less than $50,000 a year. So that's nothing given the issue at hand. Very low political will is another problem. So if a state doesn't want to act, what can you do, right? You can name and shame them forever and they want to act. What do you do? So this is a huge barrier, but advocacy done strategically can overcome that. There is also the principle of progressive realization, which I mentioned earlier, people thinking, well, health issues take time. Why don't you give us time? They need 20 years to respond to skin cancer, which is a shame because you can easily prevent skin cancer by providing sunscreen. So progressive realization I see as an excuse, but it is used as a reason and is a barrier. Finally, the capacity of the albinism movement. We are kind of behind in the capacity. We have improved a lot, okay, compared to the beginning of this century. But I would say that in terms of strategic advocacy and knowing how to jump those hurdles in a way that's effective is something we're still learning. Okay, we're almost there. And this is a quick slide to show you just in countries that haven't had good intervention on the rights of people with albinism. This is usually the circle of life. Yeah, when they're born, they might survive infanticide, but I can say infanticide is reducing nowadays. And I barely heard any reports by my final 2 years at the UN. Once they survive their birth level and they go into schooling is impacted because there's no accommodation. There was one data out of Namibia, over 40% of people with albinism dropped out of school because of lack of accommodation due to bullying, discrimination from both students and teachers. This impacts employment opportunities, especially employment indoors, because people with albinism need to work indoors to be protected from skin cancer. This brings them into the chances of being poor. And the issue of poverty is a lot of people try to survive by doing petty trading, farming, work that leaves them outdoors. Again, this exposes them to skin cancer, and it is why there's oftentimes we see that people with albinism have contracted cancer and some have died by age 40. Over 90% have contracted some level and some have passed away by age 40. So this is a very worrying statistic. In high resource settings, like in Europe and other similar parts of the world, North America, there are issues as well of a different type on the low end of the spectrum. I can say the condition is still hyper visible and disability integration is not very consolidated. Some countries have successfully integrated the issue as a disability, others are struggling. Ignorance of the condition continues, especially in the health sector, even socially. Stigma and name calling, especially children, their experience in school is still quite bad, generally speaking. There are also barriers to getting assistive devices, sometimes for vision impairment. Sometimes there are policies that apply in terms of disability policies, and they're not well implemented. And finally, there is sometimes barriers to accessing social support because maybe they see you don't qualify, you don't really have a disability. Just a photo of people with albinism worldwide, that's to show this is a global condition. And for those who don't know, a quick slide about albinism, that it is a genetically inherited condition resulting in lack of pigmentation in the skin, hair, and eyes. The frequency varies worldwide, can be as high as 1 in 1,000 in parts of Africa. And we often say people with albinism, not albino, because person with albinism puts the person before the condition. We also don't say people living with albinism, since you don't live with the condition in the house, you live with the person. Okay, some implications. I think I have a couple of slides to go here, so just bear with me. Some implications about protection in human rights, protecting people's social impacts with the human rights framework, is that you have to be contextual. So it takes time to understand the context, to do a human rights situation analysis. Partnerships are necessary because of how human rights interlink. No right stands on its own. Advocacy is needed in human rights. Why? Because people flying in and helping a country is not a long-term plan. What happens if that organization can no longer fly in and then people are back to square one? So human rights advocacy is essential because it gets the government to commit to its own people so that when we who fly in and out no longer do, the country can keep going and people have capacity to keep asking the government, holding them accountable. And finally, another implication is, as I said before, is the agency of the people themselves. I cannot state this too much. I think it's crucial. And it's part of the ways of humanizing people with albinism and giving them the confidence that is often taken away from them in social interactions. And finally, some best practices, affirmative action. We all know what that is, which means to prioritize some people for a given period of time. Otherwise, they won't have access to things like jobs and opportunities like that. Specific laws on albinism have been passed in some countries, like Guinea. There are also action planning on albinism. Some countries have national action plans and policies, such as Uganda and Kenya. Integration into the disability programming. I've seen that people with albinism, we can't expect people to go from oppression and social impacts that are negative to established and balanced psychologically overnight. So mentorship and coaching I find very important to support people with albinism. And then this is why peer groups are also very important for those who have arrived there, for instance, to put out a hand to support those coming up. And there's lots of reasons for hope. 200 plus albinism groups in Africa and worldwide. Most of these 200 in Africa, by the way. So that's very good news because the situation there is more egregious. We have the Global Albinism Alliance, the Africa Albinism Network. Albinism is integrated into the UN and the AU's agenda. Attacks are on the decline. The human rights framework is very useful. And partnerships to transform people's lives, people with albinism exist. Like I belong through my organization, Africa Albinism Network, to a consortium of universities and researchers called the Mothering and Albinism Project. It's a transdisciplinary project, and you can learn more at motheringandalbinism.com, where we have produced a lot of research and implementation notes. So before I conclude here, happy International Albinism Awareness Day today, June 13. And I would like to invite you to support people with albinism worldwide by signing this petition, which we've created to call on the WHO to put sun blockers or sunscreen back on the list of essential medicines. This is in support of the UN expert on albinism. Currently, she is trying to get the WHO, along with the Global Albinism Alliance and other entities, to have sunscreen back on the WHO's essential medicine list so that countries will now be obligated to purchase them and make them affordable, available, and ultimately to save the lives of people with albinism from skin cancer. So visit our website if you want to sign that petition, or our social media. We are on LinkedIn, X, Instagram, and Facebook, and we will be very happy if you can sign up. And I thank you very much for listening. I look forward to answering some of your questions right now. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. As we are now in our Q&A session, please submit any questions you may have in the webinar chat, and all speakers will answer them shortly.
Okay.
So thank you very much, IK, for that insightful talk. It was really, really, really educating. Thank you so much. So we have a few questions for you. So thank you also. I mean, it's good to know that there are organizations working to make sunscreen available for everyone with uh, for people living with albinism, because actually there was a question asking what the organizations were doing, I mean, as regards making sunscreens available, especially in low-income countries where people with albinism are honestly most are unable to afford um, something as basic as sunscreen. As sunscreen can be quite expensive. So thank you for that. For that. So quickly, please, as a non-healthcare professional yourself, what do you think? How would you? How do you think also other non-healthcare people can raise awareness and also support people living with albinism?
Sure. So on that first question, I would just invite him today to that goes very far, and to share posts about it once they've done so. In fact, when you sign the petition, you get an opportunity to download a small certificate that says, I just signed the petition. So you can do that and spread the word for us. We want to get thousands of people on that petition. This is literally going to save lives. And I know that it's not easy for everyone to intervene on this issue. So even if it's just a simple ask, I would like to put it out there. If you have specific countries where you want to help people with albinism, then you can email us at africaalbinismnetwork.org, info@, and we will give you contact, or even the Global Albinism Alliance can give you contact of groups in the country you're interested in, so that you can do more specific, concrete support.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that. So, I mean, working with in different worldwide and in different regions, what do you think are the challenges? Are they similar for people living with albinism in all regions, or there are specific challenges for people living with albinism, and how that can be tackled?
Mhm. So I referred to some of that in my presentation about how in low resource settings and in high resource settings, that's really an artificial dichotomy, because as you know, sometimes what we call low resource settings is really just a very rich country that is poorly managed. So I think that's important for people to realize that sometimes we do advocacy in these countries, not because we are not sensitive to the low resource, but because we know there's resources and they're poorly managed, that they can do their jobs. So I use that artificial dichotomy anyway to just separate the issues that those who are living in situations where there's not enough support face more egregious human rights situations, such as in a lot of countries in sub-Saharan Africa, not all, but a lot, South Asia, the South Pacific, some parts of South America. So I think that the issues depend on socioeconomic situation in the country, but also depend on how visible you are. If you're a person with albinism in Europe, you might face less discrimination, but keep in mind that people live in ethnic conclaves as well. So you might be in Europe, but your entire community are Black people. And so you might face a very different lifestyle in your community from when you go out into the mainstream. The particular milieu versus the larger environment, and also the level of socioeconomic development in the country.
Okay, thank you. So would also another question here is that you help provide educational resources or materials, or direct us to where we can get educational materials to learn more about albinism and its social impacts. So
sure.
Can you say a little bit about that?
Sure. So there's a report you can Google. I co-wrote a report titled Albinism Worldwide, a Human Rights Perspective. And that report covers several countries. You can get a lot of detail about social impact by region, by country. So Albinism Worldwide, a Human Rights Perspective. There is also a digital library on our website, africaalbinismnetwork.org. And we have the largest digital library on albinism around the world. So you just go there, you find well over 500 articles that have been curated, and many of them are about social impact.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So bearing in mind the social impacts and the trauma people with albinism have been facing, especially for the young children who had to drop out of school. Are there opportunities, or what other opportunities available for them for mental health counseling, or guidance, of course, that would help the
This is a new area. There's not a lot of investment on this right now. Research is only coming up very slowly, gathering the data on people's level of trauma and their mental health. To date, we have mostly more anecdotal reports, the ones that came into the UN when I was in the mandate. There was also the ones that I've seen in a few studies that have been conducted. I know there's a recent PhD study on that. Another dermatologist did work on that in Africa. And consistently, there is more of a generalized trauma in people with albinism, which is not surprising. Waking up every day to a society that doesn't want you there. Even till now, as soon as I go out with people with albinism and there's two of us on the street, everybody's staring at you, like wondering what's going on. Like, is this a sign that the world is coming to an end? And so to have an issue with belonging from very little, and some people down to their families rejecting them. I've seen children who were told to eat separately from the other siblings. I've seen people who were the chickens were. So all of that has created a very difficult situation for people with albinism. Suicidal ideation have been reported, actual suicide. So I hope more mental health experts will come into this field to give support, counseling, or even help us develop like guidance notes. Yeah, that would be quite useful.
Yes, I agree. Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much. And just the last but not the least question here. Do you have pregnant women with albinism, are there specific difficulties they face vis-a-vis the healthcare, the healthcare access, and also the care they get while giving birth or during pregnancy? What are some of the challenges you think women living with albinism and pregnant as well in facing?
Good. So motheringanalbinism.com is our website where we at the Africa Albinism Network have collaborated to produce some studies on this. So far, we have data from 2 countries. We're going into a third right now. And what we're seeing emerging from from Tanzania and South Africa, we're going into Ghana, is that women with albinism are treated very poorly when they're pregnant. To the post and the prenatal stages, they are mocked. Some of the issues identified was generalized mockery, like, oh, you two are having sex, or who did this to you? Like she couldn't choose to have a baby, and or they would, give advice that was wrong, if they have a child with albinism themselves, or there would be a refusal to touch them. The nurses will cover themselves in a different way, because they don't want to handle the woman with albinism. Then there's the mothers who don't have albinism, who have a child with albinism. Those ones have an even more difficult time because they didn't expect to have a child, whereas the person with albinism is used to the stigma, unfortunately. But the mother without is really shocked, like nurses running out of the room when the baby comes out, and the mother left there with the baby, like, because people are like, I can't touch this, or you just give back to something. What is this? Like, you just like, so the trauma for the mothers begins in the hospital, and that trauma has led people to abandon their children because they just couldn't handle that, or because the husband left them instantly. So there's a lot of complex layering of women impacted by albinism that could be read up on at motheringanalbinism.com.
Yeah, so great. So what opportunities have there been for women, for these healthcare workers who take deliveries, towards people living with albinism? What training or information or education has been given?
So this is the next stage of our research. We are trying to put our research in action. The findings that we have is going to inform the guidelines that we produce for nurses. We have in the group our multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary consortium. We have nurses, deans of nurses from universities in Ghana, Tanzania, South Africa, and even in Canada as well. And we're going to develop these guidelines based on the data once everything is collected and we have confirmed the trends, then we will contribute to this resources that then the local professors of nursing can integrate into their curricula.
Okay, so someone is wishing you a happy Albinism Awareness Day and also asking how can the Albinism Association of Nigeria join the Global Albinism Alliance?
That is a question for the Global Albinism Alliance, so I invite you to contact them. They probably can answer your question. I am with the Africa Albinism Network, but I'm sure they can help you with that if you reach out to them.
So maybe you can tell them how they can join yours.
Africa Albinism Network is not members based. We did a research before we formed and realized that the member based is good, but at the Africa level can be quite challenging because we're a very diverse continent, linguistically, geographically, culturally, albinism-wise. So the cost of managing that was surpassing the cost of actually doing the work. So we put that aside and leave membership to those who can manage it at a different level. And our emphasis is on partnerships because in any case, membership and partnerships tend to bring out the same results with less stress on the partners angle from our perspective at the Africa level. So we don't have members, but if you send us an email saying you want to be on our database, then you can get information. We add you to the WhatsApp group, and then who knows, we might see each other in the future.
Okay, great. So is it open to people who do not have albinism as well, or?
Yes, if everybody can subscribe to our newsletter because then you know what we're doing. You can tell us when you want to help us out or when you want to make a contribution or a suggestion. So everybody can subscribe. So if you go to our website, africaalbinismnetwork.org, and scroll down, just subscribe and we stay in touch that way. But to be on the database, you have to be an albinism group so we can measure, we can kind of contain our source of information, so to speak, in terms of research. But everybody can subscribe and everybody can follow us on social media.
Okay, thank you so much for this insightful time. Over to Akash.
On behalf of GLODERM and the Global Albinism Alliance, we'd like to thank you for participating in our webinar, and we encourage you to go to our social media platforms to learn more about upcoming events, webinars, programs, and more. Anything to add, Antoine?
Well, thank you again for joining us today. We very much hope that you've extended your knowledge about albinism through this webinar session. And we very much hope that you will now share the information and at your turn raise awareness about albinism among your colleagues and in your location. Thank you very much.
And finally, I'd just like to thank our sponsors, CeraVe, Ellis Foundation, and the International Society of Dermatology. Thank you all and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you. Goodbye.